I was asked to introduce David this evening, so I'm going to say a few things very briefly. I know you'd want to hear from him more than me. I'll say this. David said something the other morning at his talk about considering himself a lucky duck. And he said that in reference to being so fortunate to be able to graduate from the Cooper Union and then be asked to stay and to grow, to work collaboratively within the school and with John Hejduk. I'm also a fellow lucky duck, I was thinking about the other morning. And as you said, it was just that simple and very beautifully simple. And in talking or in thinking about making an introduction, I'm here to say a few words about David, who's then going to say a few words about John Hejduk and his work. And I thought I would start by reflecting on something that happened before another lecture that took place in this room 30 years ago. And that was going to be a lecture by Colt Himmelblau. And so it's 1985. I personally am a first-year student in the School of Architecture, very new, 18, very green. And Dean Hejduk got up to introduce the talk. But before he did, he began to tell a story, and that story was how he and his wife Gloria had spent the night prior up in their attic looking at UFOs out the window. And so I have to be clear that this was not comical, it was not meant insincerely, it was a deep contemplation of the coexistence of humans and the extraterrestrial. John conveyed that experience with almost a spiritual understanding. And, you know, you all call this a WTF moment. That's what the term is now. But I said to myself at that moment, where the hell am I? And I learned very quickly that I was in a sanctuary of thought. Then a couple of years later, David and I met when we were both students. What he didn't really get into the other day when he was talking about that transition he made into being a lucky duck was that the detail of it, which is that when he was a thesis student here, class was given a site. The site measured, was about, I think, 6 foot by 7 foot in length, a 6 by 5 grid. Each student in the class was given a square site, microsite within that field. Everyone built a model of that site, and the intention was that each person was going to make a program and an intervention, if I remember correctly, within that space. David decided that he was going to take over the whole site, and he began a rather fantastical journey of envisioning what ultimately became a forever house with numerous inhabitants and numerous structures that those inhabitants were going to occupy. And in order to be able to do that, he had to build himself a drafting table that was almost vertical, that was probably 10 foot by 10 foot, that required a wooden scaffolding for him to climb up onto and draw from. And I would say that that act of expanding that realm of his project resonated so powerfully with the dean that he took action and he cultivated David's work. And so for the next couple of years, probably longer, I observed as he, after being a Cooper Union student, continued to climb his scaffolding and make his drawings and literally draw in every direction. So those were early moments in the germination of what became what I consider, you know, an ongoing dialogue between them and the maturation of a relationship that led David to be the associate dean of the school, and then at our moment of greatest lament, the acting dean of the school. So what I would say is that I've observed you now for a number of ways over the years in your various capacities. I kind of consider us spheres that travel within the same orbit, sometimes from a distance, sometimes almost at a tangent. I think sometimes we bump and push off, and then sometimes I think there are confluences of energies that commingle us. I would say that in terms of what I've observed about your teaching, I consider David to be someone who deeply understands the ethos of this place and its immediate, recent, and distant pasts. And in that regard, I consider him to be a fierce protector of that ethos, and someone who, in his teaching, is ever mindful of the critical importance of capturing the spirit of the discipline and conveying that understanding to his students, and fabricating with them collaborative teaching examples of the social contract, year after year. And now, almost in the vein of the Forever House, David is doing this upstate at the Mill with arts and letters and numbers. So I just want to say, I know how important the significance of the social contract and the act of capturing spirit were to John, and they were literally part of his DNA. So I really can't think of a more meaningful person to introduce than you to talk about John and his work.
Wow. Oh, wow. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for that really moving and beautiful introduction. Amazing as I listen, there's a number of moments of resonance from exactly what you said that I'm going to try to get to tonight. So I guess it was one of those commingling moments. And I want to thank you all for coming. It's really great to see you all. It's very moving. I love this community. And also, you know, to the whole School of Architecture for what you did in bringing this exhibition and the pieces out front here. I think bringing them and building them was a very important moment, creates a very important moment in the school, and I really moved by it. I want to say a little something about these two talks. You know, while this talk is a continuation of the part one from the other day, it's constructed a bit differently. The other day, the talk was called Hejduk, Hamlet, and the Ghost Promise. And that was, you know, kind of an arc through a very long trajectory of works, from the Texas houses in the 1950s to the diamond houses in the 1960s, through the wall house in the 1970s, through the social contract works of the 80s and 90s, to the House of the Suicide and the House of the Mother of Suicide, and of course with some help from Hamlet and the Globe Theater for any of you who are here. In this talk, which is called John Hejduk Through the Wall, it is in echo and conversation with all of that, with all of those pieces, which is why I felt the need to do a two-part talk. But tonight, I'd like to focus on really two works. The Victims Project from the late 1980s and the Sanctuaries works. And in particular, the chapel for the wedding of the moon and sun. Now, these Sanctuaries works are really from the last years of John Hejduk's life, from 1998 and 99. So Victims and Sanctuaries are both powerful and large works. They're mysterious, and they're deeply moving, and they're also, I would say, wonderfully difficult to speak of. The Victims Project is a direct engagement with the horrors of the Holocaust and the profound loss of that time and our embodied memory of loss. And the work speaks in a way, a social contract that was perhaps contained in the ghost promises that I was talking about a lot on Tuesday morning. The Sanctuaries drawings, John Hejduk was literally wrestling with life and death, and with the spaces that he was in during that time that he was making those drawings. And these works are a deep meditation on his own religiosity, its spaces and structures, or as John said, after we sat with the Sanctuaries drawings for a long, extended silence. He was very good at doing that. Sometimes, 5-10 minutes was well within reason to sit in silence and look at something. Sometimes it would become 20 minutes. He said, David, I'm wrestling with the angels. And he meant it. So, these are important works, they're difficult works of John Hejduk. And I had to work on and construct this talk a bit differently than the one the other day. This is more, in a way, it's more of a constellation. I would say it's a focused constellation, but it definitely requires peripheral vision. Okay? So the focusing in on these two works with a lot of peripheral vision, meaning all kinds of other key points, ideas, moments, gestures, stories, structures, with the hope of constructing here a space within which we can share these works together. So I want to begin with John Hejduk's voice.
During a certain season in Texas, at dusk, some tree trunks seem to be phosphorescent. They give off a dull, crystalline light. Upon close scrutiny, it is found that the trunks of the trees are completely covered with discarded shells that once were the outer bodies of certain insects. The startling fact is that the shell is intact. The form is exactly as it was when its original inhabitant was inside, with one difference. The inside has left, leaving the outer form, which looks like an X-ray, producing the luminous effect. Suddenly, we hear a chorus of sound coming from the dark leaves above. It is the sound of the insects hidden in the tree in their new metaphysical form. What is strange about the phenomenon is that we can see the insect's shell forms clinging to the tree. These empty shells, a form that life has abandoned. While we fix our eyes on these apparitions, we hear the sound of the insect in its new form, hidden in the trees. We can hear it, but we cannot see it. The sound we hear is a soul sound.
So, I want to share with you the first time that I ever saw John Hejduk. It was 1984. I was 18. I just moved to New York City from Albany, New York. And some people told me that there was a symposium on architecture, and we should go. It was at NYU. There was a large hall with sort of the vertical theater seating, stage down low, long table on the stage, and there were about 6 or 7 architects. Most of them were New York City corporate architects, SOM, etc. And they were talking back and forth to each other. And they weren't really talking about anything. And it seemed that they were making private jokes, but there wasn't any punchlines that the audience could keep up with. But there was this really large guy sitting there at the table. And he stood out, and not just because he was huge, but he was not really participating in this back and forth with the others. So then something interesting happened. Somebody in the audience jumped up and they, threw a notebook down the stairs, yelled out, what the hell is going on here? All these people are here and you're not speaking about anything. And then another person jumped up and yelled out again. And then people in the audience started to yell at those people who had done that. And then some people on the stage started, on the panel, started to yell at the audience. I mean, it was a real ruckus. And I was watching this big guy because he wasn't saying a word. He had this huge magic marker in his hand. And he had opened his folder up, right? And he was leaning, right, over the table, and he was writing on the folder. And I couldn't see what he was writing, but I was totally focused on that. And people are yelling back and forth, and he's not even looking up. So then, he slowly stands up, and then you realize, John was 6'10". And in his booming voice, he says, "I've written a word on this piece of paper." And everybody froze. I fell into complete silence. And then he holds it up over his head and says, "Enough!" In huge letters. The room falls into total silence. Now, what happened next is what I'll really never forget. John Hejduk stood there in the silence, and he started to speak about otherness, and the ineffable, about space and voice, and about the social poetic dimensions of otherness, and the social contract. At some point he said, you can either impregnate the world with meaning or with emptiness. You can't do both. You have to choose. I mean, it was stunning. Now he sat down, and one of the other panelists in a sarcastic voice says, define otherness. Without missing a beat, John said, the breath of Bacchus, that's otherness. Now, then he started to describe a stone sculpture by Michelangelo and how its lips were just open, just apart, just a tiny little bit. And he said, if you move close and put your cheek up close, just in front of those lips, you can feel the breath of Bacchus coming from within the stone body. And if you're very quiet and listen, you could hear the voice contained in that breath. He said, that's otherness, and that's what architecture is built of. I mean, this was a remarkable experience. I was being a kid from Albany. I grew up in trucking. I'd seen plenty of ruckuses before, but I'd never seen anything like that. I'd never heard anybody speak like that. And while I didn't have much of an idea of what otherness meant, I could sense it. I could feel something about its gesture. In fact, that was probably my first conscious experience of otherness. John Hejduk himself was other. That room, what he did in that room was other. And as I thought about the breath and voice and Bacchus, it seemed so incredible, but also so simple. In the sense that, we speak, our breath does in fact commingle with our language, and that does create our voice. That's ineffable. When I thought about his voice in that room and the silence and listening that it created in that room, his voice was being listened to in the room as closely as he had said we had to listen to Bacchus. So something fell into place about what he must have meant by the social poetic dimensions of the social contract. Also words I'd never heard before. Now, over the years, I would come to understand many other dimensions of this. But in that moment, in that room, I had witnessed something. I had witnessed a master in the arts of teaching and learning. His name was John Hejduk. I learned that he had a school called the Cooper Union. And to quote John, when he told the story of how he found the Cooper Union in 1947, quote, and thus began my illicit affair with the Cooper Union, which would profoundly affect how I would do things in the future. End quote. I want to share a poem with you from John called The Breath of Bacchus. Your Carrara lips part, inhaling softly a whisper, which disappears into the gray hollow of a voided stone. Your incised eyes are bewildered by the hush within your mouth. The grapes of your hair fall over your forehead, polished to a coldness. Your Creator made a miracle through the surface of his hands and wrists. He blew air into your impenetrable white marble, producing the first inanimate sigh, silencing all sound. That's the end of the poem, and now is a quote from John Hejduk. I breathe because it keeps me alive. But there's a more important reason. Because when I breathe the air in, I breathe in all the sounds from all the voices since the beginning of time. All the voices that have placed thoughts into the air. That is, thoughts escaping from the soul through the voice into the air, which I breathe in. Sounds that cannot be heard. Silent sounds, filling the air that generations have spoken into. Consequently, filling me with worlds that are an invisible text. An invisible sounding text which mingles my thoughts and that are invisible. In essence, an internal communication takes place, giving the sense of the sublimity of silent transferences. End quote. An invisible sounding text which mingles my thoughts that are invisible. Silent transferences. So, space is literate. Space speaks in silence. So I want us to try to mingle in our minds two thoughts from John. One, I breathe because it keeps me alive, but there's a more important reason. With the breath of Bacchus coming from within the stone body, we begin to sense the question of how is it that we author silence when we author space? Our thoughts and actions are constructing these spaces of participation, and space itself is a participant in our thoughts and actions. So imagined and remembered or dreamed of, even spoken of worlds are commingling with this given world out here of substance and light and gravity and sound. Our memories, our imagination, language, voice, stories, knowledge, our hopes, our fears, desires, they're all participating in co-constructing this experience. And it's quite possible that this continuous conversation, through that, space, in fact, is completing us. It's the other half of us. Allows us to understand ourselves and others. So in the simplest sense, I'm saying, as we build this room is building us. Construct spaces, they're constructing us. And in this sense, that social contract is a form of participation, contribution among our fellow citizens. But it is also always a contract with space itself, as the other half of us. A contract to embody the widest, most nuanced spectrum of what it is to be human into our reciprocal spaces. That's what architecture is built on. This is the Victims project. This book was published by the Architectural Association in 1986, and it was published to coincide with the construction of the collapse of time, the work I showed last time. But as stated in the introduction to the book, quote, "Victims contain 67 structures presented to the city and to the citizens of Berlin. A place to be created over 2 30-year periods, a growing incremental place, incremental time." That's the plan of Victims, the 67 pieces. And the project is sited on land that formerly contained the torture chambers used by the Gestapo during World War II, in the middle of Berlin. It actually had been an art school, bizarrely enough. John Hejduk considered this plan to be one of his seminal works of architecture. He placed it with the Wall House and with his last book of poems, which is called Lines No Fire Could Burn, as one of his most important inventions. The introduction to the book Victims offers these enigmatic words under the title, Thoughts of an Architect. Quote, 1, that architectural tracings are apparitions, outlines, figments. They are not diagrams, but ghosts. 2, tracings are similar to X-rays. They penetrate internally. 3, erasures imply former existences. 4, drawings and tracings are like the hands of the blind, touching the surfaces of the face in order to understand a sense of volume, depth, and penetration. 5, the lead of an architect's pencil disappears, drawn away, metamorphosis. End quote. So, like many people, I had always found this project to be quite mysterious. It's a powerful, creative invention of both individual structures and a collective idea of their spatial relationships. The plan is Big Big Bang. Its particular tangencies and placements are extraordinary. They always seem to speak to something unseen, to some hidden forces. And it was not until a discovery by 2 architecture students that I began to grasp the true nature of victims. In 2006, Sergon Ionescu and Tara Rodriguez Besosa, they completed their thesis in architecture at Pratt. Their teachers were 2 Cooper Union alumni, Ron O'Ron and Anthony Titus. I want to make sure to say all their names because I believe they discovered something in their research that is an important contribution to understanding John Hejduk's work. While it was always clear that the Victims Project was located on the site of a former Gestapo torture chamber in the middle of Berlin, what is not stated in the project is the manner in which these victims were located to arrive at such a remarkable plan. When one overlays the plan of victims with the plans of the now long-gone buildings that had previously inhabited the site, the idea comes into focus. The dark parts are showing the location of the previous buildings. Each victim is located in a specific tangency to the previously existing structures. Each victim is spatially, geometrically, and structurally addressing the previous architectural condition, a past condition that has been erased in both the drawings and the physical landscape. Some of the victims are touching the corners of the previous structures. Others are unhinging corners. Some victims sit back into open spaces, while others pass right through a space from one side to the other. Some are bridging over previous landscape situations, such as small creeks that no longer exist. Others lower themselves down into waters that no longer flow. Each structure is located in the present site and in the site which no longer exists. It's like an eclipse. The presence of one time takes the form of a shadow within another time. Each victim inhabits both worlds at the same time. For me, this was a profound revelation. Understanding this fact, one recognizes the words at the beginning of the book as hints, indications of an idea. Quote, erasures imply former existences. They are not diagrams, but ghosts. End quote. Now, these ideas of transformation, of erasing and eclipsing, came much earlier to John Hejduk. We heard an early echo of them in what he said about the wall house that I showed the other day. Quote, the hypotenuse of the diamond became the wall in plan. One could erase the peripheral vestiges of the diamond outline. Wall house 1 was a new discovery. End quote. Without a doubt, victims was a new discovery, one rooted in the revelations of the Wall House. And I believe that the miraculous, enigmatic plan of victims is an architectural surgery. One set of structures of exacting precision cutting into and inhabiting another set of structures of former existence. Now, the state of total unconsciousness one inhabits during surgery is cognitively described as the cessation or suspension of time. Deep anesthesia brings the patient to a place outside of time. For the patient, the beginning and the end of surgery are perceptually the same moment. For the patient, the corporeal struggle of surgery occurs in a continuous present. Now the surgeon inhabits both worlds, the time and space of the surgery room and of the patient. This is a quote from Dr. Richard Selzer, a surgeon who spoke at the Cooper Union in this room many times. He's a friend of John's, and we would invite him to share incredible thoughts. This is Selzer, quote, "I have often felt while fighting in the middle of the night to keep drowning lungs afloat or to staunch a flow of blood that the room about me was participating in the struggle. How more than once the walls gasped and then stood still at the instant of death." End quote. Like many forms of surgery, victims required the cessation of time. And this suspension was not the result of anesthesia. I believe the collapse of time required for the Victims Project was born in the transfixing condition of the still stop John Hejduk discovered in the Wall House that we talked about on Tuesday. He willed up his embodied knowledge of this still stop to confront the spaces of terror of that previous time. This knowledge, this ability to be transfixed, is essential to the final phase of the victim's architectural surgery, the erasures of the former structures. Their physical space disappears, leaving just the magnificent plan of the victims.
I looked at that vertical drawing, Berlin drawing of Mies, and I was transfixed. It had a quality of transfixing one. And my focus, went to it. I had known it before. And I was absolutely staggered by it because I had a phenomenological experience occur. It was like seeing a resurrection. In other words, that drawing, that glass tower, began to levitate. There was a levitation within the space and within the room, I guess within my own soul. And things began to drop off. In other words, the architectural drawing room that I was in dropped off. And then the building dropped off. I mean, the new mama dropped off. In other words, all the actual so-called reality, physical space, dropped off and disappeared. And what was only left was that really magnificent drawing. And it made me understand what the word master architect or master builder meant.
So in this film, in addition to describing being transfixed, the building falling away, so-called physical space disappearing, at the end of the clip, John Hejduk says something quite important. He links those very conditions to what he understood the words master architect or master builder to mean. I believe this particular understanding of building is the exact knowledge and creative precision at work in the construction of victims. Through a deep internal process, John Hejduk creatively and directly dropped the room off and worked with and within the still life that inhabits life. He entered into the suspended time that he would call solid space. and operated with great risk and precision and honesty and care and gentleness. I want to repeat a quote from John. If one gyrates, rotates ellipses with sufficient energies, they become a straight line, moving from space to space, from time to time. And the original curvature is unseen, but nonetheless felt. End quote. That was his entire introduction to the book Soundings. The particular dynamics of the victim plan contain a certain buoyancy, a rotating, floating condition. It's as if the hedges surrounding the site contained a great unseen flood, lifting the victims and erasing the previous structures. I've often imagined that the ark that saved all the creatures from the flood was an arc in time. Arc is in a curve, slowing time. If the arc is a curve that slows time, then the creatures in it experience the flood in a whole different way. If the arc slows time, aligning it with lifetime, the flood would not be a destructive event, it would be a place that allowed life. Like the ark, victims contains sufficient energies to become an architectural hinge, moving from time to time, from space to space. The last architecture before the flood, and the first architecture after, the sole structures surviving that event. Francis Yates said, quote, "What protects us against delirium or hallucination are not our critical powers, but the structure of our space." End quote. I believe that John Hejduk understood that if left alone, the spaces of that time would continue to do harm to our present tense situation in space. Even if the previous spaces had already been erased from the physical side, their violent impact on our memory and imagination, on our structure and space, on the air we breathe in, continued across time. This is why Victims is an embodied architectural surgery, a reenactment of space into space, or structure into structure. And from within the suspended time, the rotating victim structures are operating on that space, sublimely filling life back into that air, continuously constructing an inverse perspective from which to address that unspeakable loss. So it's not that victims have been built, it's not that they will be built, they are building. They're always building. Like Hamlet's escape from the Globe Theatre and Hamlet, Shakespeare's resurrection, victims exist in a continuous present. They are always telling at every given instant, at every given moment. Each victim is empathetically calling us close, to whisper what holds up one, holds up all. Life is sacred. Through this continuous retelling, the violent spaces of one time are metamorphosized into spaces of life in another time. The entire Victims project is an architectural ghost, the shadow of one world made present in another. And here, this memory of loss, and inverse perspectives of the house of the suicide, the house of the mother of suicide, here it becomes a total eclipse. Organically and alchemically and metabolically and neurologically and structurally and spatially and temporally, victims are transforming the forms of horror into life-giving forms. So in that sense, Victims is quite literally a life-sustaining work. This social contract is with space itself. It speaks to the enigmatic fact of life itself as a continuous communicative exchange between our spirit and our spaces. And these exchanges need not only occur in the sort of struggles of mortal consequence or the instant of death, as Selzer said. Our communicative exchanges with space also speak in whispers, telling of our fragilities, embodying with great nuance the material and the spatial empathy of life. And I believe we find this in making the ineffable present throughout all of the works of John Hejduk. And I'd like to now move to sanctuaries. And I want to share this project. It's 30 The sanctuary's drawings are 32 drawings constructed between 1999 and 2000. It's the year of John Hejduk's passing. These works are a deep meditation on John's religiosity and on the spaces and times that he was in when he made them. Now, John was always concerned with structure. And most definitely that included the structures of the sacred and the religious. Now, this is obviously a vast territory, but as a way of moving towards the sanctuary's drawings, I want to offer just a few ideas and a few moments. So, the origin of the word religion is religion, as in to retie, to reconnect, religion. The origin of the word sacred comes from sack, S-A-C, sack. And it means a sack, like a sack of potatoes, something hanging into this world. So the sacred is understood as connected to another world, hanging into this world, and the religion can be understood as here, standing here, and working to reconnect or religion, retie the fallen sacks. Now, what's very interesting is that there's a structural relationship here of tension and compression, right? Hanging into this world or lifting up in compression. You can think of this tension and compression, and you can look at the history of sacred art and architecture and religious art and architecture. You can do a structural analysis of the transformations over the centuries, from Yoruba practices to the pyramids, to the flying buttresses of the great cathedrals, to Santiago de Compostela with its hanging light in the center, the Sagrada Familia, obviously, the chapel at Ronchamp. Now, one of John's constant and I think great questions we often ask, what was the joint in the crucifix? Meaning, how was it built? The wood joint between the vertical and the horizontal wooden members of the crucifix. Now, for John, this was a mystery that related to the structures of tension and compression and the question of Christ. Meaning the idea of a body that is a body that is also infinite. Body, infinite, tension, compression, vertical, horizontal, body is weight. John saw the crucifix as a structural proposition about this question, trying to imagine what the joint was. So I want to share with you a project done by a student that asked this exact question of the joint of the crucifix. And unfortunately, Stephen and I have not been able to identify the student's name. We will. But this is a work done here at the Cooper Union in 1995 as part of there's a thesis year that we lovingly call the Fruitier now. That year we were looking very closely at fruit and still lives. We started the year with John bringing in right here a bowl of fruit, a bowl of wax fruit, and a Cezanne still life of fruit. And he said, which one tastes better? Now, as you can guess, that led to a conversation. And at the end of that conversation, we asked the students the wonderfully difficult question to build a piece of fruit. Think about that. The difficult art of the simple, right? There's a lot of enigmas in that. It led to a kind of amazing explosion, let's say, in the studios of creative searching into the enigmas of fruit and the still life, the life of the still life. Apples being made of steel, heated to red, lemons that became camera obscuras, grapes that were cast and cut and painted still lives of themselves as they were cut, celery, bananas, there were flies everywhere, mice everywhere. The studio became a kind of microclimate of its own, of life and imagination. One of the students worked with roses. These are wooden roses, built roses. Now, as they were working on it, they began to work with the question of what was the joint of the crucifix. And something kind of remarkable happened, which was the idea that the gathering of the roses, each of these stems, that white spot is the end cut of all the stems gathered together. So when you stand it up, you have this explosion. Incredible structural proposition with the emotive depth of the question. I want to read two quotes. The first is from Elizabeth Stone. She said, quote, "Making the decision to have a child is momentous. It is to decide forever to have your heart go walking around outside your body." Another quote, which John Hejduk would often refer to as his favorite line of poetry. It's Paul Celan. Quote, my love for you is such that it would have thrown the lid off of my coffin were it not for the weight of the rose that you placed on it. The heart walking around outside the body, the weight of the rose. So there's this liminal, in-between pressurization, right? The weight of the rose pushing the condition of sort of emotive depth, still life in life, the deeply human question of artifice, right? Rising, right? Rising sun, the sun. And that barely difference between, because it says, my love for you is such, it's not was, my love for you is such that it would have thrown the weight off my coffin were it not for the weight of rose. That bare difference of the weight of substance. One of the other things that John would often look at very closely was George Braque's Blackbird paintings. And this was one of his favorites. And he would often ask, where's the bird? Is it a bird that was flying through the painting studio and got caught, got entangled in one of the easels? Is it a painting of a bird resting on an easel? As a painting in the studio. Is it a bird caught in the wallpaper in the back of the room? Or is the painted bird flying through the room that we're in while we're looking at the painting? Made of paint. And it was, of course, all of these at the same time. The bird is caught between all of these entanglements. And these questions were truly crucial to John. He did a project called the Blackbird Chapel, which had to do with the bird being entangled within a wall house. Now, the Blackbird Chapel is on the cover of Sanctuaries, the book of the Sanctuaries drawings, which I think offers a hint of the kind of structures and entanglements that John was working on in the book. Okay, so I want to ask you to hold all of that in and up as we spend some time with the Sanctuaries drawings and listen to them. This is Christ Chapel. It was done in 1996. I mean, you can see the question of the vertical, the horizontal, and the diagonal, and it's in direct conversation between the figure of Christ, the Son, and the community, the diagonal of the community. So it's building these linkages of echoing with the solar system and our living systems, community. Between the singular and the many, between the first person point of view and the omniscient point of view, between the Son, and the witnesses. So, like the spaces of the social contract works, the house of the suicide, the house of the mother of suicide, victims, these sanctuaries are speaking to us, they're speaking to our humanity, and they're speaking in silence. Perhaps if space speaks silence, we too contain a silence deep within us. A silence which is not the denial of language or history or time, but the void, which at once is prefiguring and circumscribing, moving through us. I mean, it could be that space contains a silence that speaks to a silence contained within us. The silence of space doesn't diminish the capacity of space to be literate. It moves in, communicates to our interior thought, it informs an internal literacy, situating both our individual imaginations and constructing the spaces between us. This is the key of that social contract. The spaces between us and our works, between us and each other, between us and all time. So it is not that sanctuaries have been built or will be built. They are always building, like Hamlet escaped from the closed theater and Hamlet, Shakespeare's resurrection. Sanctuaries exist in a continuous present. Each of these spaces is empathetically calling us close to whisper. So, not very long ago, Dr. Richard Selzer, the great surgeon and writer, came to the Cooper Union and he spoke to the architecture school in this room. And he began his talk by presenting two pietas, one carved in wood and one in stone. And he went through them as a surgeon. He talked about the chisel as a scalpel and compared cutting the living substance of the wood and the dead substance of the stone, about the water held within the fibers of Mary's wooden arms and the veins held within Christ's stone belly. Then he put up a singular image, a crucifixion carved in ivory. It was a powerful, haunting crucifixion. Christ's figure cut into a single ivory tusk. It had no arms and was carved within the curve of the tusk. And as the image hovered on the screen, Dr. Selzer again described the scalpel cutting into the ivory, the careful attention to the pressure of the hand, the resistance of the ivory. He then began to explicate, as a surgeon, the medical conditions leading up to Christ's death. The dehydration from the preceding days, the loss of blood due to the punctures and lacerations, and finally the collapse of diaphragm and lungs from his bodily weight hanging on the cross. And then, in a rare and specific intelligence, Dr. Selzer turned his attention to the hunted elephant. And he went through the medical conditions of the elephant's death. The punctures and blood loss causing him to slow, his weakened legs finally giving way under his massive weight, the internal damage as he rolled horizontally, the removal of the tusks and the collapse of the lungs under the elephant's own weight. Now, looking up at the image of the ivory tusk crucifix, I felt something deeply. I saw the elephant roaming through the lowland plains, the terror of a ruthless slaughter, tossing aside the life of the elephant, stealing the only part of the elephant's skeleton exposed during life, exposing with photonegative precision the internal structure of the elephant by removing its only external piece. I felt the distant figure of Christ, all of him, his language, faith, abstract, concrete, power, echoing through and colliding with this distant figure of the elephant. This powerful ivory figure hovered between these two absent figures. It was manifesting in odd symmetry their double sacrifice. Dr. Selzer ended the talk with a last pieta. And this one was carved not in wood or stone or ivory. He had discovered a pieta in Shakespeare's King Lear. Specifically, King Lear holding Mary, holding his dear dead Cordelia. King Lear as Mary, holding his dear dead Cordelia as Christ. And in perfect Shakespearean English, Dr. Selzer moved out into the audience, completing the lines of King Lear on one knee, his arms cradling an absent Cordelia. And when the lights came up, he held the void Christ between his arms and the image of the ivory crucifix hovering over his head. And John turned to me and just simply said, "Unforgettable," and left. The sanctuary's works of John Hejduk are a continuous shining moment within the discipline of architecture, and they speak to the enigmatic fact that life itself is a continuous communicative exchange. And these exchanges need not only occur in struggles of mortal consequence. And there's a final work that I want to share tonight, which is the chapel for the wedding of the moon and the sun. And again, like the other ones, I want to do that by sharing a few moments, works, stories to help us get into it. This is a remarkable image captured by Jacob Ordson. He was a first-year student here at Cooper Architecture School a number of years ago. You can see the figure flying over the horizon, over the ocean, toward the sun, a kind of Icarus figure. And it is there. And at the same time, it's Jacob hanging his drawing on a wall in the lobby. The sun over the horizon is a light in the ceiling. The speckling reflections of the sun in the water are speckles of paint reflecting the ceiling light. So it's artifice and memory and imagination are commingling in these two horizons. And this is a project that John Hejduk did for Icarus. And this is a project that's called The Tomb of the Sun, Moon, and Star. It's important to think about these. I want you to layer all the things I'm putting here. The Tomb of the Sun, Moon, and Star. All right. So this is Homa Shojai, one of my dearest friends in the world, and that's me. As you can see, we were studio mates. In the late 80s, both graduated in 1991. And Homa's thesis really dealt with empathy and light and vision. And she was looking very intensely at this question I mentioned the other day of two faces looking at each other in silence, the Levi-Strauss proposition that the highest state of the human condition is found in the space between two faces looking at each other in silence, pre-language, pre-epistemology, the spatial sensation of empathy. She was looking at that very closely in terms of like the pupils and what's happening. Right? Where's the light? How is it that I see you and you see me? What, is there any inverse perspectives going on inside of that? And then she started to bring that to lungs, breath, and voice, the heart, and the breath of Bacchus. And she then arrived at something rather remarkable, which was these pieces. These are camera obscuras, in a sense. Right? There's these spaces, these little pinholes. The entire inside of that was covered in negatives, right? So photo negatives, a camera obscura. It had 8 holes, right? So you see the two eyes looking at each other. But what happens is when you pierce through, because there's the skin, there's an internal skin of photo negative all around the inside. So in order for light to enter, you have to pierce the negative in all the holes. And then when you unfold all those negatives, you get these remarkable images. So this is all the pieces unfolded from that. And for her, these were self-portraits being made by those pieces. Each one of them is a self-portrait. So this. Now these were shot in the lobby. So you'll notice fragments of columns that were being pulled in. And the part of it has to do with these suns, these stars that happen, which are the piercing, allowing an internal light between the two pupils. Now, when Homa presented her architecture thesis here in the lobby, she had constructed a remarkable wall. I mean, this was like, 10 by 30 feet of astounding images you can imagine. I only showed you a few little pieces. The site that Stephen mentioned, she filled that with these. And these portraits were taken in the lobby, so they contained the light of the lobby, and they commingled it with the self-portrait structures, and then these images were hanging there, which means there was remarkable echoes between the light in the room and the light in the photos, because it was the same light captured. When she finished her presentation, there was this kind of perfect silence, pregnant silence. 150 people sort of holding their breath. And it wasn't a short one. And then finally John Hejduk began to speak, and he said, quote, "In the 60s, I went down into one of those dens over there in the East Village, and there was a gentleman, a serious, intelligent, remarkable, gentle gentleman. And he had with him a guitar. And he was doing things with this guitar, other things, otherworldly things. And I knew that what I was hearing, the sounds that were in that room, had never existed. These sounds had never been sounded before. I mean, in the universe. Those sounds had never occurred before that moment in that room. It was an epiphany that sound could happen that had never happened. And that man's name was Mr. James Hendricks. He went on to say, and today, here in this room, today I know that this light, Homa's light, this light that we are looking at, that is hitting our eyes, here in this room, has never existed before. Has never been seen before, anywhere in the universe. The universe has never universed this light before." End quote. Now, obviously that was an unforgettable moment that happened in that room. From Jimmy's sound to Homa's light to John's voice, words all commingling, mixing together. That, for me, is the deepest social contract. The ineffable beauty of that room is at once everything and nothing, which for me is everything. Funny parentheses, when my son Rostam was about 3 or 4, I showed him the film of John telling the bear story that I showed in the last talk. And I asked him if he knew who that was. And he said, "Yes, that's John Hendricks." Classic. I love it. He knew he was close. So the chapel is the wedding of the moon and the sun. Emerging out of the sanctuary's drawings. In this work, John Hejduk was directly engaged in a communicative exchange with the sublimity of silent transformances. In this chapel, we witness the compression of a lifetime of John Hejduk's questions and works into a work of extraordinary spiritual depth. All the way back to seeing through the wall from the Texas houses, through the diamond house with its compressed spaces, through the wall of the wall houses, and to the social contract works, victims and sanctuaries. The body of Christ is suspended within, hovering within the light of the moon and the sun, held up by their wedding, by the still stop of their eclipse. An eclipse, by definition, inhabits two worlds. The presence of one sphere takes the form of a shadow within another, like a ghost, at once remaining from the beyond while becoming ineffably present within the sphere of life. So making the decision to have a child is momentous, is to decide forever to have your heart go walking around outside of your body. And in this chapel, the wedding of the moon and sun creates a sustaining light. It's suspended. A continuous echoing eclipse within which Christ is hovering, commingling the worlds beyond. The sun echoing through the wall, through the sun, levitating a heart outside of time. Held up, rising, the moon and sun, literally seen laterally through the wall. Two luminous spheres, eyes looking inward, inverting the focal points, seeing the sun from a distance. And this zoetropic dance of moon and sun and earth is turning and telling and mirroring. It animates the sun, levitates the heart outside of the body. It's an inverted animation. All is still within the chapel, and the cosmos turns, turning the light of the solar system through the wall, animating a still life, a timeless animation, a zoetrope sun. Zoa means life, trope means turning, life-turning sun in suspended time. We see this suspended moment in the early questions of John Hejduk, as the square of the Texas houses becomes the diamond house, as the compression of the station points and focal points creating the line of the wall house. This chapel still stops the time at the instant just before collapse, just before the diamond house becomes the wall. In that gasp of stillness, the breath of Bacchus is caught, stopped, elongated out into time through this continuous eclipsing light of the moon and the sun. So how do we enter such a space or such a time? I want to repeat the quote from John Hejduk on the wall house. This house had to do with the idea of the present, the celebration of the two-dimensional. It was leading and condensing to a point it had to do with time. We see the three-dimensionalizing of a two-dimensional condition, an inhabitation of the hypotenuse. In the solid space of that wall, of that present tense, is no metaphor. The wall house holds open this space in the hypotenuse, right, preventing the collapse. Ultimately, within this chapel of the wedding of the moon and the sun, we are transfixed by a continuous resurrection. The room drops off, a levitation occurs within the space and within our souls. In creating an architecture of such great force, of such intensity and originality, scope, depth, I believe that John Hejduk altered the discipline. As Shakespeare dismantled and reconstructed the structure of theater, John Hejduk transformed the very structure of the discipline of architecture. I want to show a few last clips of.
I'm a product of 1908 to 38. That's my time. I can't help it. I was born in 1929. And I don't go over into past 1938. No generations could go from 38 to 68 or 68 to 98. That's 2 more generations after mine. That's the excitement. Each generation has its structure. And I gave you my structure. You want the other structures? You have to ask them. What their structure? There's 2 more generations after me. I mean, alive and kicking. That's the modern movement. That's the modern movement.
So this is, of course, us, and most crucially, I would say you. So I want to end with a few observations about school, the same as I ended it last talk. I want to show you one more.
I, for one, have been blessed with a moment in education where I have had a social contract. And many of the people sitting today in this audience have made my life more understandable because of their understanding of the social contract.
So this, of course, speaks to what, for John Hejduk, was the most essential, the deepest social contract, the program that he worked on and in his entire life, the program of school. John Hejduk used to say, I've been in school for 35 years. He lived a lifetime of creative exploration, probing, and constant invention. As I mentioned the other day, these two talks combined is maybe 15% of John's work, probably more like 10. Probably would take 15 talks like this to actually cover the breadth of it. He never stopped. And all of this was within the sanctuaries of school, always working towards and intimately knowing that education and the discipline of architecture contains something deeply mysterious and deeply human. And I believe heard in their own proper beat and measure, the works and teachings of John Hejduk offer a deeply human sonnet, a soul song, as he would say, of space and structure, of ethics and poetics, of breath and life. John Hejduk gave us his structure, and with it, the seeds of an eclipse within the structure of the discipline of architecture, the seeds of a new form of practice and a new form of school. Quote, to be within the Cooper Union is to be, for the advancement of science and art, is to be within a spiritual place. This is John. An authentic place. An institution that is lovingly held in trust. A place that believes one of society's prime social responsibilities is towards learning and education in the deepest sense. It's a place that contributes to thought, free thought, thought that is exploratory thought, founded by Peter Cooper, a man with a vision that still sustains and maintains the spirit of place and cares for enlightenment. I don't think there are many things more important than being a teacher and being a student. That, to me, is the deepest social contract. To understand the idea that individual creativity within a willing community is a profound social act. The privilege of being teachers and students within this remarkable place, to be teachers in a place of spirit, to be teachers of spirit, and to be with spirited students. All one can do is to celebrate one's discipline. End quote. So individual creativity within a willing community is a profound social act. Education, by definition, is a transformative pursuit. That's the pursuit. And in its most fundamental sense, school is not a means to a predetermined end or an instrumental future. School is a community, a place that contributes to thought, free thought, thought that is exploratory thought, a place for intense study, a place to create new ways of knowing, new pathways of understanding that embody our best hopes and aspirations. School is a sanctuary itself for searching into the foundations of our disciplines, into their structures, for excavating deep enough into our questions and our structures that we find the fragile fibers of the invisible structures between us that make our lives more understandable. School is a place of creative urgency, a place to create new works, works of empathy, of ethics, of imagination, works that include the nuance of our personal imagination within our shared stories and spaces, what's between us. School is a place to share thoughts, actions, gestures that embody the widest, most nuanced spectrum of what it is to be human into our reciprocal spaces. And there's one last story I want to tell. Stephen touched on it at the beginning. And it begins with this question, which was a question asked by Dean John Hejduk to the thesis class in 1990. The question was this table that we built of the thesis class in wood and steel, and it served as our site for the entire thesis year. And I, as Stephen said, went on to draw and write that site and basically to inhabit it for almost 10 years. I was working in the Hewitt building across the street in a big structure, drawing and writing, and that really was central to John and I's conversations. We would visit, every week or two, and I would visit his office and see what he's working on. In the fall of 1999, so 10 years after we built that table, and John was working on That's the year John was working on the sanctuary drawings. I entered the third floor lobby of the school, and to my complete surprise, I saw the table standing in the middle of that space. I mean, literally almost 10 years after its construction, and I had no notice that it was going to appear again. It sort of took my breath away. And John Hejduk came into the lobby, and he said, I have to ask you, I want to do something, but I want to ask you first. Should I tell you what I want to do? Yes. I want to paint the table black. All black. Everything. Black. So after a brief pause, I said, okay, John, all black. Now, for the next few weeks, as the table stood in the lobby, I kept expecting to enter and see it painted black. And it didn't happen. One of these days, I entered, and John was standing at the table. And when I approached, he looked up and he said, David, I have a different idea. It's not ready to go into black yet. What I really want to do is paint it all white. And leave it white for a time, and then go to black. So like 3 weeks of white, and then it'd be ready, it'd go to black. Now this began immediately. Within a day, thesis class painted the table white. About 3 weeks later, I was teaching in the studio, and John came in and asked if I would join him in his office. And I did, and he said that he knew he had said it would be time to go to black in 3 weeks, but he was wrong. He now wanted to go half white and half black. And we should keep it that way until he knew it was time to go black. So the table was soon painted half white and half black, and it stood like that in the lobby for the entire semester. In the last week of school, John came to me, and with the most quiet and gentle voice, he said, David, I can't do it. I just can't paint the table black. Can I ask you to do it? You will have to. It is for you to do, and you will know when you have to do it. It must be done, but it's simply not for me to do. So, about 10 years after that, I finally decided to paint the table black. And a good friend of mine, Charles Didot, he made a suggestion that I do it as a celebration. So I did it with my children. And it was kind of like a painting party. We just had this wild dancing, running around, painting party. They're much older than that now. And then, when I got back to New York City, I realized one of those completely inexplicable, unexplainable, amazing things. That without any conscious knowledge, intention, no advanced decision, didn't even know, we painted the table on July 19, 2009, which was John Hejduk's 80th birthday. I had no idea. I found that out when I got back in September. So, I believe that exploratory, independent, uncontainable works will spark from the pragmatics of the poetic imagination in search of the ethical dimensions of the human condition. Education must bear our globe as Hamlet did his. Must struggle to find a largeness of being that transforms the crises of understanding our world is becoming. Perhaps the greatest source of this largeness of being is found in our fragilities of being. For in the act of embracing our fragilities, ethics finds its substance and its space. And if we listen closely, we can hear its voice. And I'm going to end with John Hejduk's voice.
I, as a so-called administrator, had a number of objectives, but one of the objectives is to bring teachers, let's talk the teachers, in to a place. This place has a history. This place, Peter Cooper, there was a spirit. The Peter Cooper spirit is still here. So to bring people into a place and leave them be. So the faculty, over the years, if you ever look at the list of faculty of the last 30 years, I mean, it's 100 people or something like that. By and large, they all were individual souls, independent souls. It doesn't make it easy to be a so-called dean because of their independence, but I made it a sacred vow that when somebody was here, that they are released from committee work and all this kind of nonsense. So they should come to do what they know how to do, I guess, is to teach.
How do you teach architecture?
Osmotically, by osmosis. I never draw for the students, you know, draw over with them, and I never tell them what to do. I try to, in fact, draw them out. In other words, draw what's inside them out and just hit at certain key points, and that they can then, you know, develop their ideas. I mean, that's it. I'm against that kind of didactic teaching that they're told exactly what to do all the time. I mean, the younger ones, okay, in the first year, perhaps, but later on, by the end of the fifth year, these are people in their mid-20s, and I always say, you know, that Darwin took the voyage, the 5-year voyage, at the age of 22, and the sea captain was 25. So you have to be cognizant that that time of life is more, I think, one of the great creative periods. Maybe there's later on another great creative period, but that's one of them, and that should be gently, really gently, with gentleness. And I think the interesting part about this place is that everybody comes down thinking they're going to see what they anticipate to see, and they're shocked because all of a sudden the student body have moved into another realm of thought. And so that institution has affected not only architectural schools, but architectural thought, and ultimately architecture. I enjoy youth because, not that I'm like Dracula, you know, that I can feed off their youth, but I do. They feed off my age and I feed off their youth. It's a marvelous relationship that goes on. But on the other hand, they are the speculative future. I'm the speculative past, but they're the speculative future, which is fantastic. I've been here, 30 years, and if we graduate, say, 20 students a year, it would be 600 students, but it's not even that. It might be 400 students have graduated in the last 30 years. And a great percentage of those students are not only operable, but influential. Because I think that's the point. The point is whatever they do, right, they think. And consequently, they're in demand. It's a school. I like the idea. I like being in school. Because you take the real true nature of a school, it's a different, it's a school of thought. Thoughts, not thought, thoughts. And its objective is to study. That's a good objective.
Thank you.